Hey everyone, Dan here. Before we get into it, if you enjoy these videos, please hit the like and subscribe button. And keep in mind that these are my own thoughts, opinions, and ideas. These are not meant to be, nor should you take them as investment or trading advice in any way, shape, or form. Do your own due diligence, put in the work for yourself, and make your decisions based on that. Enjoy.
All right, folks, today we're going to look at TTM Squeeze Indicator and how I use it to help inform jumping into plays or when something might come up. So here we're looking at NEO, and I have the TTM Squeeze Indicator here. So, whatever charting software you're using or charting site, if you look under the indicators, they should have TTM Squeeze. I would assume so. This is Webull that I'm using. We will flip over here to the Think or Swim study as well and talk about this, how to use it on here. But in Webull, they also give a pretty simple introduction, which I think is fine and sufficient for our purposes here. But TTM Squeeze is a volatility and momentum indicator introduced by John Carter. It capitalizes on the tendency for price to break out strongly after consolidating in a tight trading range. So that's what we're looking for here. We're looking for these periods of red. That's what's called triggering on the TTM Squeeze Indicator. Periods of red, this is where it is compressing, where it's consolidating, and where it's potentially getting an opportunity for a big breakout. Now, keep in mind, TTM Squeeze, when it fires, if there is an outsized move, that's how I typically refer to it, not as a breakout or something like that. I typically say outsized move. When that happens, if the outsized move comes, here's the tricky part. You don't know if it's to the upside or the downside. So just because it's triggering and fires, if something does happen, it does not mean that it has to have a big breakout to the upside. It could also mean that it's going to have a big breakdown to the downside. That said, there's definitely periods of time, NEO is sort of in one now, to be honest. You saw this trigger and fire, and nothing happened. Basically, right? This certainly wouldn't be considered an outsized move. And now it's re-triggering. And so we do see this, I talk about this often on the channel, a re-trigger and a refire. So ideally with the TTM Squeeze Indicator, you have a trigger period, you start watching the stock then, getting indications on which side it might be breaking. And when it fires, which is when it turns green, that's when you expect the outsized move to come. Now, that's under best case scenario. Sometimes, as is life, right, things don't go to plan. And so sometimes it triggers and fires and it just stays relatively flat. However, we have noticed many, many times in the channel periods where it triggers and fires, nothing happens, and then it re-triggers, which is what is happening right now for NEO. It's in a re-trigger moment, as I would call it, since the last trigger and fire resulted in no outsized move. And so oftentimes on the re-trigger and refire, that's where we really see the big move. Because, think about it this way. If the TTM Squeeze Indicator is picking up on periods of consolidation prior to a breakout, if it triggers, indicating, hey, it's consolidating, it's sort of looks like it's gaining potential for a breakout, and then it fires and nothing happens, by nothing happening, what that means is it's just continuing to consolidate into some sort of range, right? It doesn't mean it has to be perfectly sideways, of course, but it's consolidating in some sort of a range. Maybe it's slightly up, maybe it's slightly down, but it is overall consolidating. So all that this really means, to a degree, is that this trigger period gets extended. And so that's when you see it re-triggering. That's when there's other factors coming into play, some momentum building, while the price is also still staying within that range. So that's why I think oftentimes the re-trigger and refire can be can yield even better results. But you don't know, right, if it's going to happen or not. So we see this trigger period back here. This was in July of 2024, and then it fired. And essentially, you did get a bit of a move, right? Oh, I should also mention, don't expect that when it fires, that sometimes that does kick off a move, but sometimes it's going to fire for a few candles before it really starts to react to it. So in a way, honestly, I like that, because if just the fire happened on candle one, you have like no time to react, no time to get into it. If you think you have a good sort of grasp on which direction the stock price might go once it fires, at least if it fires and there's a few candles that are put in before the move happens, that gives you an opportunity to catch it and get in, right? So here you had several candles to get in, and it would have brought the stock, when it's triggering, it was about, say, high fours, mid to high fours, and that took it down to 363. So if you played it to the downside, you had about $1 move to the downside, so a really big percentage downside swing for a stock at this price. And then what did we get back here? We got triggering again. So here's an example of what I was just talking about, sort of like late in the trigger, and then certainly on candle one here is plus 14%. Even if you had got in then, or you got in a couple days later, you still had plenty of juice to squeeze, right? So say you got in around 5, this ran into the 7. So again, huge percentage gain. So a really good call out there by the TTM Squeeze Indicator, I would say, on that move. And you can see, when it's triggering and starting to fire, you can see on the histogram here, that green, as it's presented here on Webull, that is bullish momentum, right? So you're seeing a brief uptick happening here in bullish momentum as it's getting late in the trigger. And back here, you would have seen, a little uptick, and then when it fired, you saw that die down really quickly. And then when you got the outsized move, it had flipped from very slight bullish momentum to much deeper, not super deep, but much deeper than this, bearish momentum. So that's always going to be the sticking point, or the tricky part, is which way is the stock price going? And that's where TTM Squeeze Indicator won't always, or maybe even won't often, give a clear indication of that. However, it does give you an opportunity to catch a bigger than normal move, which is obviously nice. So that's what the TTM Squeeze Indicator looks like on Webull. On Thinkorswim, this is actually, I rarely turn it on Webull. I usually use it here on the Thinkorswim setup. So Thinkorswim, you can just come in with your indicators, add in TTM Squeeze. These are my settings that I have: 20, 1.5, 2, and 1.0. You can set it up however you want. You can make those adjustments as you need. The really nice thing that I have on Thinkorswim, which I think is helpful, is I have a TTM Squeeze scanner. And so up in the scanner section, I set up basically, hey, make a list for me of stocks that fit certain criteria, right? They have certain volume, they have certain beta, so on and so forth. But the key component is that it's triggering currently on the TTM Squeeze Indicator. So, NEO, INTC, let me see. Let's look at charge point. So charge point, yep, see? It's had a few triggers and fires recently, right? Lengthy trigger, fire, nothing really happened. Well, brief trigger, fire, nothing really happened. Trigger, fire, nothing happened. So maybe nothing will yield from this, but it does show me that, okay, it's on this list because, like I said, it fits that criteria of certain volume, certain beta, so on and so forth, but also, and most importantly, it is currently triggering. If we look at, let's see, AMD is on the list. Also, some stocks, right, with charge point there, we saw several where it's just triggering and firing and nothing is happening. Sometimes with certain stocks, I don't use, or I don't really rely on certain indicators. And like if I saw that set up with charge point and saw, that over and over and over again, I would probably disregard it and say, okay, I'm not going to trust that the TTM Squeeze Indicator is going to give me a clear view of when an outside move is coming on charge point. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen with every stock, but certain factors, certainly I think sometimes with the lower price stocks, I mean, charge point is only $1.12 right now, and it's been super sideways for a super long time, sideways and slightly down, and sometimes it just doesn't work well with those setups. AMD, let's look and see how these periods went. We had a decent trigger here. This is when the stock price was about 180 or so, and it fired, and that's when it really took off, topped out at 227, and that was just over a few days. So you could have gotten 180 to 227, so $45 a share, something like that, and having held it for just a few days. So pretty wild move there. And then you see, as the firing continues, the volatility continues. So, and then you could have ridden that fire all the way to the downside as well. So we'd see this oftentimes. I typically call it the roller coaster, where trigger and fire happens on the TTM Squeeze Indicator, and you get both moves. And yeah, that can be very tricky. So this is why you need other things to be looking at, right? Like here, if you had looked at these ATR levels, we can talk about this in a different video, but call trigger here. So if you had seen it going up and reached the +1 ATR, you could have said, okay, I'm going to lock in profit there. That would have been at about 218 or so. So you wouldn't have sold at the top, but it's foolish to expect that of yourself. And you could have grabbed it and sold at 218. And then, when you saw it started to plummet and it came below the put trigger, you could have grabbed those again around 180 or so, and you could have ridden it all the way down into the 140s with puts, or however you would want to play the downside there. So there is oftentimes this roller coaster, trigger, fire, and it just shoots up, and then you get you get essentially two outsized moves in opposite directions. And yeah, it's wild, but like the stock was going to do this anyway, right? So getting an indicator to show you, hey, something might be about to pop off, it can be helpful to sort of give you a heads up and try to position yourself accordingly. Here we see really lengthy trigger and then a fire, and you get a very similar motion, right? You could have picked this up around the 160s, tops out in like the 180s, but then it comes down really hard, right? From the 180s, it comes down here just a few weeks later into the 120s, and then starts to sort of consolidate again. And right now, AMD is putting in an initial trigger candle. So we'll see what happens from there, but you see how on AMD, for example, this you can look at and you can say, okay, oftentimes when AMD gets volatile, or at least recently when it's gotten volatile and the TTM Squeeze Indicator calls it out, it often goes both ways. You get an initial move one direction, and then you do get the counter move. And so maybe that gives you something to sort of look for. Just because it's happened in the past doesn't mean it happens again. But, you're sort of trying to piece, it's puzzle pieces that you're putting together. So at least this is what it's done in the past. I don't know if it's going to do it this time, but I'm going to really be alert, and I'm going to really keep my eye open, especially if you only play upside. Say all you do is buy shares. If you get that TTM Squeeze Indicator and it triggers and fires and you get a big pull to the downside, you might want to really watch that to see if there are indications that it's going to also have that same volatile swing back to the upside, because then you could try to grab somewhere at a support level, or look for EMAs to cross over, however it is that you look for potentials for trend reversal. There'll also be a video on that coming out soon. And it gives you an opportunity there to hop in and try to ride those shares long for that volatility to the upside. But yeah, simple as that. I use the histogram a little bit. It is nice sometimes to see if there's a divergence where price is like moving up, but it's also telling me that the bearish momentum is picking up, or opposite, the price is coming down, but it's telling me that bullish momentum is picking up. Sometimes I look for like a divergence in that sense, but other than that, I mostly just use it to try to eyeball the trigger and fire, see if it seems to be a stock that has reacted to that in the past, or if it sort of like goes through the motions but nothing really happens, and then try to look at other factors where it is at certain levels, anything on sort of the EMA side of things that might indicate, okay, if this pops off, it's likely to go to the upside, it's likely to pull back further, whatever it is. But looking for other indications as, okay, if this is going to pop off, which way do I think it's going to go? That, I would say, is by far the hardest part of it. Otherwise, it just does the work for you, right? It's red when it's consolidating or triggering, green when the indicator says, okay, this is an opportunity for an outsized move. Don't know if it'll happen, but it's an opportunity. All right, folks. Well, I hope that was interesting to some of you. Maybe gives you something to toy around with. If it doesn't work, toss it out the window. If it does, cool. Now you have something else to look at, or maybe something to look at that can replace something else that hasn't been working very well for you. In any case, I certainly appreciate you watching, and as always, I will see you in the next video.